Welcome here. Man, I'm so glad it rained again. We were getting dry, right? Welcome to this Pentecost Sunday morning and our second in this series of light shining out in the darkness. Last week we had Justina Neufeld tell us about being a refugee on the move in Europe in World War II and then coming to the United States. Next week we are going to have something that hits very close to home, and we're entitling it Bridging the Gap, MBs and GCs in Buhler. So I don't know if there's going to be a throwdown or not, but Pastor Nick Rempel is going to be sharing, and I think that's going to be rich. He's going to tell stories about how he pastored and the things that they did together, maybe some of the roots of our sibling rivalry, if you will. But today we gather to hear from the associate pastor of Shalom Mennonite Church in Newton, Ben Woodward-Breckbill, and he's going to talk about being a sanctuary church. About a year ago, Shalom Mennonite Church and First Mennonite Church of Christian in Mount Ridge announced that they would be a sanctuary church for undocumented brothers and sisters who just needed a place of sanctuary. And that hit the news quite well. A lot of circuits picked that up, both nationally and in Kansas. And out of that came a conversation from some of you in the congregation wanting to know more about it. And being sort of feeling two tensions about meeting the needs of our brothers and sisters, and yet also wondering how do we work that with also honoring the government of the land. And so we were asked by the deacons, and the deacons as well agreed to this, to just write a letter to our brothers and sisters at Shalom and First Mennonite Church to say, hey, what can you tell us about this? What was the decision-making process? What's behind this? How does this look? And at that time, they weren't ready, or it was a little short notice to do the summer program and have them come out again and do it during the summer last summer. And so we have them this summer. And this maybe sets the scene of the sort of the tension or maybe the wrestling we find ourselves in. This is a quote from one of the BMC parishioners. A sanctuary church seems to fit with the teaching of Jesus. At the same time, we are to honor our government and obey its laws as long as they don't conflict with the laws of God. Now, the problem is, where is this line between obeying what Jesus taught and what government asks, and how do we get around any laws we disagree with? This issue, like many others, is not just that simple. How do I develop my own position on sanctuary churches? Today, we work towards that as we bring in Ben to speak on behalf of Shalom. Obviously, you can't probably speak on behalf of First Mennonite Church in Mount Ridge. And I see this as a conversation piece between brother and sister churches, between things that are really happening in this world. And what can we learn from it based on our own theology, our own call of God to meet Him where He's at work in the world. Heavenly Father, open our ears, open Ben's mouth to speak. Be here with us as we wrestle with the realities of our calling as a church, our calling to be good citizens, our calling to be little Christs in this world, to be light in the midst of darkness. Be with us as we hear. Amen. Ben, let's welcome Ben here. A warm Buhler welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Wilmer. Thank you all for welcoming me here, inviting us to be a part of this conversation that we're having at Shalom and that I see you're having here as well. In preparing for today, I looked back at the letter that the congregation of Buhler wrote to us and was surprised to realize that it was all the way back in August of last year that letter arrived. I'm glad we were finally able to come out and share a little bit. Just a little bit of introduction For me, so you know who is talking to you, my name is Ben Woodward-Breckbill. I live in Newton, associate pastor at Shalom Mennonite Church. I have been at Shalom since September of 2017, so coming up on 2 years here. My wife and I moved to Newton from Northern Ireland, where I was finishing up my theology studies and working with a mediation organization there. She was studying peace building, but that was just a 1 year time in Northern Ireland. I originally am from Lincoln, Nebraska, not too far away, and Laurel spent a lot of her childhood in Newton as well. So we're relatively local. So I think that the way I'd like to begin is by leaning a little bit on the fact that this journey to sanctuary, where while it's available to many congregations, it would look different in every situation that it occurs in. So just to say that for Shalom Mennonite Church, where we are right now is very much tied in with just uniquenesses of periods in congregational life, relationships that have been built recently and in the long term. There's a lot of uniqueness that goes into a story like this. So I think that the best way to start in is to just tell a little bit about how Shalom has arrived at this point. So Shalom had a lead pastor, Eric Masonary, from about the year 2000 to about 2013, so a relatively long period of time. And when he decided that it was time to move on into a different assignment, the congregation went into a period of reflection and sort of self-identity work and trying to figure out who would be the next person to be called and what the congregation was looking for going forward. That was a relatively long process. They took a full year before even putting together a pastoral search committee. And then after the committee was formed, took a little while to hire a new pastor. That new pastor arrived in fall of 2015, Rachel Ringenberg-Miller. After that time, as Rachel took some time to get herself established in the community, the congregation seemed ready to do a different kind of work. It had been multiple years of looking inward, considering the congregation itself, who Shalom is, that sort of thing. And so in 2016, a series of conversations began asking the question, how can we look outward? What can we do to look out from this very important self-work that we're doing to what we're doing in the community at large? And so a series of congregational conversations followed, and the conclusion drawn, the consensus arrived at, was that the congregation would work to build more relationships with immigrant neighbors, immigrant brothers and sisters in the Newton area and in the south central Kansas region. Because, as we all know, immigration is in the news a lot. It's a hot topic, and so the curiosity is to say, how do we as a church community interact with the people in our community, especially those of a different culture, of a different ethnicity from us? So there was about a year-long period of putting out feelers, engaging with the local Spanish-speaking Mennonite Church, of whom, in Newton, Iglesia Mennonita Casa Betania, of whom some are third or fourth generation Americans, and some are new immigrants. There's a wide variety, but all Spanish speaking. So there was some engagement there. There's engagement in just other immigration community events. And there were also opportunities. We called in from Wichita, someone from Sunflower Community Action who works with immigrants for legal assistance and all sorts of aid that they might need. So we had some learning opportunities and built relationships with that community as well. During that time, they were on another pastoral search that ended up with hiring me. I arrived in the fall of 2017, and my first day at work was a Wednesday, and Wednesday at Shalom during the school year involves a community meal in the evening, followed by youth groups. And after youth group ended at 8 o'clock, I returned to the office and found Pastor Rachel was still there having a phone call. It sounded serious, but I didn't know what it was about. I left, and the next day, my second day on the job, found out that phone call was from this contact, this relationship that we had built in Wichita from Sunflower Community Action, asking the question, would your congregation be open to being a location of sanctuary for someone in need? And the honest answer was, I don't know. I don't know if our congregation is ready to do that, able to do that, and we don't know what it would look like. But that call, followed by another call a few days later about a different situation, prompted us to ask that question seriously for ourselves within the congregation. What might this look like? And so over the course of the next several months, we decided to start learning as much as we could about what sanctuary is, what it would look like for us, what steps we would need to take. That's what we engaged with. So, what follows now is a few of the things that we learned about this question, what is sanctuary? And I should add that if anything that I say, I'll leave some time for questions and conversation at the end, but at any point in the middle here, if there's something that could be clarified or you'd like a little bit more on, I'm happy to take questions as we go. So, what is sanctuary? In the United States, the first sanctuary movement happened in the 1980s when people in Arizona and New Mexico noticed a large flow of people from Central America coming through the country, or coming up to the United States, and in distress, not knowing that they were not safe at home, and trying to escape corruption, violence in their home countries. So they were making their way to the United States and finding a very hard life here. And there were faith communities saying, these people have arrived here, needing help. How can we be of assistance? And so that first sanctuary movement was an honest effort to ask that question. What does it mean for a church to offer shelter to someone in need? After the 1980s, this idea of a sanctuary movement fell by the wayside a little bit, but it's renewed in the past, I would say, 10 years or so, with, again, an observation of more people entering the country, but also more people who have been here for a long time finding themselves targeted for immigration enforcement, let's say. So not just new arrivals, but long-term people who have lived here for a long time, all of a sudden finding their place here more in jeopardy than they had felt it had been in the past. And so people were addressing this and saying, there are people here who have lived here for a long time, who have family and friend connections, who are parts of towns and communities who are being removed. And when these communities were finding that happening, they experienced the pain of that loss of relationship, that rending of the social fabric, and decided to act. So the idea of sanctuary itself is an ancient one. There are sanctuary cities in the Bible for people escaping from blood feuds. If you commit manslaughter, accidentally kill someone, you can escape to a sanctuary city, and you are safe from the avenger of the person you accidentally killed. So there are precedents for this sort of sanctuary location, but the idea that a church can be a location of sanctuary comes from a memorandum written by and for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, saying that they will not do, this is not an official policy or a law, but just a memorandum, that they will not do immigration enforcement actions in public sensitive locations. These places include things like hospitals, schools, large public events, parades, and things like that, and churches. That is not the location that someone will be arrested, for example, to be deported. So with that in mind, churches said, okay, what does this mean for us? How does this impact the way that we, as a unique sort of location, house of faith, might engage with our immigrant brothers and sisters? Some of the other things that we learned are that there are certain situations in which being a location of sanctuary would be helpful, and certain situations in which it would be less helpful. Most of the time that it would be helpful is when the person in question, the person at risk for deportation or feeling like they may be deported, has some sort of possibility of remaining in the country. This is true. This is one of the reasons that, or I should say, it's important for there to be a possibility of remaining in the country, for sanctuary to happen, in my view, both on the side of the congregation and on the side of the migrant. Because the congregation probably doesn't know what it would mean to host someone indefinitely in their building, because sanctuary, when someone stays in sanctuary in a church, they cannot leave, or they can leave, but knowing that if they step outside, they could be arrested, right? And also from the location, from the perspective of the migrant, living in a church building indefinitely is no one's first or second or third or fourth or fifth option. It is a case of dire extremity. People who feel like they are choosing among worst options. Sanctuary can be one of those. And that's a humbling thing to realize, that anyone who would be coming to us is in a situation of extremity. So as we went along, we had a lot of important discussions within the congregation. Some of them include what does it mean for Mennonites, let's say Mennonites of European ancestry, maybe Mennonites whose parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have also been Mennonite. What does it mean for, I put myself in that category, those of us in that category to discuss our immigrant heritage? Because we all have stories of migrations from Europe, of persecution of Anabaptist communities that have led to people leaving their homes, going to different countries, coming to the United States even. So how does this current question interact with that historical question? And I think, there are a variety of ways that it does apply and that it may not apply. But it is important to remember, just as the Israelites were reminded in the Old Testament, you were once strangers in the land of Egypt, so do not oppress strangers in your own land. That spoke to a lot of us at Shalom. We were once strangers here, so we had to rely on the hospitality of foreigners to make a new home. And what does that mean for Mennonite communities, established Mennonite communities in the United States, welcoming people who are relying on the hospitality of others? I think another important question that we were asking was this question of what do we mean when we talk about justice? And I'll just say a couple things about that because it's a complicated question, what we mean about when we talk about justice. One idea of what justice means, specifically related to this situation, is one that leaps to mind is the justice of the legal system, right? Prosecutions that can be brought, legal sentences that can be handed down by judges, law enforcement actions that can be pursued by police and federal agents. That's one sort of justice. And there is another sort of justice that I would categorize more broadly as God's justice, which is a simple acknowledgement that if there is such a thing as justice, then the justice of laws and statutes in the place that you live does not encompass all of the world, all of the human population, or all of history. But God's justice does. And so it's worth asking the question, in what way does the laws of the land that I live in interact with God's justice? As Wilmer quoted one of you all asking, it's an important question. I found myself reflecting often that when I look at the politicians in Washington, I don't often come away from that reflection thinking those are the people who really have the corner on truth, who really have the corner on what it means to be a moral person. That people are acting as they can in the best way that they can, certainly, but that doesn't mean that the laws that are handed down are perfect. And so there are a lot more complicated questions there, as I'm sure you can tell, but my view of that divine sort of justice is more pointing toward how do we live in right relationship with one another. This question of, what is the greatest commandment? Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. This is what justice looks like. But what does that look like is the ongoing question. So we went through all these learning opportunities. We discussed what our congregation might need to be ready for sanctuary, what physical improvements needed to be made. We improved one of the bathrooms to include a shower. Someone donated a washer and dryer. One of the unused classrooms that had storage in it in our basement was changed to be a livable space with a bed and a dresser. So thinking through some of those logistical aspects of what would it look like to have someone living in our building. We sought out a network of support. One of the other things that was very important to recognize as we were engaging in this question of what would it look like to be a location of sanctuary is that it was just that, being a location of sanctuary, which is one very narrow slice of the whole picture that would be, quote unquote, the sanctuary movement. A person who is staying in a church building needs emotional support, needs visits from family and friends, needs physical support, food, needs spiritual support, and also needs social services and legal support, because the idea is that there is a legal process being undergone at the same time that someone is living in sanctuary. So all of that needs to be in place as well. And Shalom Mennonite Church on our own is not capable of providing everything that an individual would need. So we recognize that what we were considering and what we were offering was not the Shalom show. It was a small slice of a much larger picture of what it would mean for someone to be living in sanctuary. We engaged with other Mennonite congregations who do have people in sanctuary or have had people in Arizona, in Ohio, in North Carolina. There are a few congregations that have been doing this work. And so we were able to engage with them to see what their experience had been like, what the reaction had been, things like that. We also consulted with lawyers, immigration attorneys, and others to ask what it would mean both for a migrant who is in sanctuary and also what it would mean for Shalom as a congregation. Lawyers are never going to advise anyone to break the law. At least this lawyer didn't, and most of the lawyers I know have never advised me to break the law. He did say, however, that in the past 20 years, no church or congregation or pastor has been prosecuted for offering sanctuary or providing sanctuary. In the 1980s, there were a few prosecutions. Those mostly involved actual assistance crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, which in central Kansas we are not able to do. And it would be a whole different conversation about whether that would be something we would want to do. So after a lot of learning experiences, we had a series of congregational conversations at Shalom about what it would mean to be a sanctuary location. A lot of questions were raised, concerns, affirmations, logistical issues. And then in February of last year, of 2018, we took a congregational vote. Just so that you can hear it out loud, this is what we voted on. This motion, the Congregational Board of Shalom Mennonite Church recommends we move forward with plans to use our building as sanctuary without concealment for undocumented immigrants who are seeking refuge during deportation proceedings. So there are a few elements in there, being a location of sanctuary. That element of during deportation proceedings sort of goes back to what I was talking about. It's important for a legal process to be going on while sanctuary is also happening. These two words of without concealment. People were concerned that Shalom would be trying to be secretive or evasive, both because the law says that concealing an immigrant is a crime, is prosecutable, but also because people didn't want to be secret about it. People wanted it to be known that this was a possibility, and the level of evasion that was happening was low. So in the aftermath of that congregational vote, we made it known that we are able to be a location of sanctuary. We returned to that phone call that came on my first day of work. At that moment, that woman's situation changed in September of 2017. She was an undocumented woman with several children who are all U.S. citizens. She was stopped for a traffic violation and then brought to the attention through that of immigration authorities who were trying to figure out what they wanted to do with her. And she, in that time, she had more time to remain in the United States to go through a legal process, etc. So there was nothing for Shalom to do in that situation right at that moment. But we made ourselves available after the vote. We told the connections that we had that this was a possibility if we were approached. And we put together what we call at Shalom a ministry team, a group of people who worked to figure out some of those questions, both how it is that we accept someone into sanctuary, how we communicate with the wider community, how we solicit help from other congregations and other organizations, and some of those pieces were worked on by the ministry team. That ministry team, members of that ministry team, have also given other talks similar to this over the course of the past year at congregations, at Bethel College, other places like that. I started attending meetings of the Immigrant Support Services Network in Wichita, a place where representatives of various immigration service agencies, mostly in Wichita, get together, talk about the work that they're doing, anything from English classes to legal support to social support. That has been a rich resource for connecting with a wide variety of people who are working in the field of immigration and the complexity there. We sent a couple of our congregation members on a learning tour with Mennonite Central Committee to the South Texas borderlands to see the conditions there, what things are like in South Texas and northern Mexico. They are actually presenting this hour at Shalom as well about their experience. That tour was just a month ago. And I think another effect of that vote has been just an increased awareness of of the situation surrounding immigration in our community. It's complex, it's ever-changing. People who live here and have lived here for a long time are always uncertain about what their status is, what new regulations might apply to them or not apply to them, how they might apply to a green card or not. And that has been something that Shalom has had to live into as well, is that we're always working with incomplete information in a lot of these situations of uncertainty, and we are always, things are always changing. It's a very nerve-wracking, anxiety-producing experience to be a migrant in the United States. And for those of us in our congregation who do not have that experience, it takes a lot of attention and a lot of listening to be able to attend to how anxious the immigrant community is and how uncertain they feel. Just one or two more comments, and then I'm open to questions. Through this all, it's been clear to me that Shalom Mennonite Church, this is just one way that we are seeking to be a congregation together. We have a broad vision of what it means to be a community. We worship and pray together. We eat and do Sunday school. We have small groups and interactions, and this through the relationships that we have built, through the working of the Spirit, has been one other way that we have sought to be a church together. And also, just a reflection that the relationships that we have built before this conversation and as a result of this conversation are essential to talking about what it is to be a sanctuary congregation. It's not some sort of outside ideal that is sort of placed upon the congregation, but it has really emerged from relationships with one another and with the wider community around us. So, yeah, I'll open it up to any questions or comments. I'm happy to respond as I can to anything else you'd like to know.
Raise your hand and a mic will be brought to you. Jason's got one on that side and I've got one on this side.
Last week, now I have less questions about sanctuary, and I just am going to delve into the immigration issue. Last week we had Justina Neufeld come to speak to us. And, I mean, she was in life-threatening situations. She said she felt fear constantly for the first 10, 13, how many years of life or whatever she was, until she got into Holland. Mm-hmm. That was her sanctuary. She had twice false papers made for her. One time it was for 2 cartons of cigarettes was the exchange for a set of papers. Now, on that, and an undertone of that, also her sanctuary were the Nazis. They got her out of Ukraine, out of South Russia, following to get out of the horrific things that were happening there. I mean, so one person's devil is another person's savior, which is a complicated thing to wrestle through. But why then? So we hear Justina, and I don't think we bat too many eyes at that, at her story. Why then do I find myself saying, well, we can't take we can't have all of Central America come up to us. At the same time, I'm reading the Bible. The alien and the widow, they are important to God. I'm not going to forget that. So that's a balancing point. Is it because they're a different skin color from me? And Justina's out of my Mennonite tradition that I don't really bat an eye? I mean, do I have to keep my racism in check, really? How do or do I not know their story as much? What's my resistance within me? Tell me.
Answer that. I live with her, so answer that question.
Sure. Yeah. What are all the? But yeah. Let me tell you all what's going on with her. So I have 3 responses to that. I think, if I can remember them all. First, I think that issues of race and culture and ethnicity are very important. It's been a process that we at Shalom have been exploring to address what it means to be engaging across cultures and races with people in this work. And it does take, again, self-reflection, cultural assumptions, being a white person in the United States is generally a very safe thing to be, and it's hard to identify with someone who doesn't experience that safety. And so that is one important piece. I think another piece about stories from World War II, for example, is that we have a lot of hindsight, and we have a lot of we've had a lot of time for the stories around that time to sort of crystallize for us. We know the uncertainty of every moment 70 years ago, 75 years ago, is not present for us now. But everyone in those situations back then also experienced the uncertainty of every moment in these difficult situations. And so I always remind myself that that what seems clear in hindsight was never clear at the time. And I did have a third thought, but I'm not sure what it was. So if it comes back to me, I'd be happy to bring it up again.
I was just wondering how the food situation works out. Do they cook their own food? Do you stock a pantry?
Yeah. So one important thing to mention is that we have not had anyone live in sanctuary at Shalom. That is not a step that has arrived yet. The idea is that yes, in the short term, people would bring food, people would bring meals. If a person is staying for weeks or months at a time, it gets very wearing to have other people bring strange food to you all the time. So the hope would be that we could stock a pantry regularly with this person's preferred grocery list, whatever that happens to be. And we would rely on donations for that, both from our congregation and from others and from people in the community. The other thought that I had, you reminded me of it. You said something about we can't have everyone from Central America coming to us. That, I think, is a common thought. And I've been weaning myself off of it simply because Shalom has been a sanctuary congregation for almost a year and a half now, and no one has come, right? That doesn't mean that there are not a lot of Central Americans coming to the United States. There are. But just as I'm sure was the case from last week's presenter, the preference is not to leave home. The question I always ask myself, again, is what would it take for me to leave my land, to leave my house, and think I may never see it again, just go somewhere else? Because, what would make me feel that unsafe or that motivated to just leave? And again, that's a sobering thing to think. So the idea that all of Central America may come, many people are finding it important to leave their homes, and many people are not yet. And people want to be at home.
I think it's difficult for us to really appreciate what self-incarceration might feel like, because that's what you're doing. Mm-hmm. If you're an immigrant who is seeking protection, Boy, that's that's pretty ugly looking. And one question I had was, is Newton still a sanctuary city or not? They were once designated as a sanctuary city.
Yeah. So just a word about that language of sanctuary city. It's nothing official that a city can sort of. It's not an official designation. It's a word for a policy that that local law enforcement does its work, which does not involve immigration enforcement, and federal officers from immigration and customs enforcement, for example, do their work, which does involve immigration enforcement. And so that word for sanctuary city is sort of the natural state of affairs for a lot of people, that local enforcement does its work in its jurisdiction without involving federal officers. And so I think Newton has been operating under that status quo, but there has been some discussion in the city council, I think, that is asking, like, are we a sanctuary city? Well, no, we aren't a sanctuary city, but what that means for the way the Newton Police Department does its work, I'm not actually sure on.
I guess the question I'm asking is getting at is, did your congregation talk anything about, well, maybe we ought to be involving ourselves more in the political process of making the larger community sanctuary, because how are you, it seems to me, going to encourage economic support for migrants? I guess I'm asking, I have no issues with a church wanting to be a sanctuary, but I think on the other hand, that's self-incarceration. That's not a good thing either. But rather, how much, what should I say, political process were you thinking about? And do you have anything to share there?
Yeah, I would just say that there's a wide variety of perspectives within Shalom congregation itself on the question.
We have one more question, and then we'll...
Sure.
Without having had the experience yet, has Shalom worked out a process should someone who has sought sanctuary been denied the legal process? Or not the process, but the end of being allowed to stay legally? Have you worked out a process of what you do next?
Yeah, that is one of the ongoing questions, and I think, I think that once again, that's mostly a conversation that needs to be had at the time. Is to what extent is the person being hosted in sanctuary willing to remain self-incarcerated? At what point does leaving the country become a better option, even if it means separation from family or community? And that's a very difficult question that I don't think there can be a firm process for, and we pray that we never come to.
I promise that was the last question. You got a quick question? Or?
I was just curious, First Christian of Mound Ridge, do you know what their status has been? Have they had a...
I don't know for sure that they have hosted anybody. They have also, as a congregation, made themselves ready, but I don't know for sure.
I was going to print off a fact sheet that First Church Christian sent us, and I forgot to do that, but I have a frequently asked question and response sheet that First Mennonite Church of Christian is working off of if you want to see that. And like you mentioned, each journey is different. Did you do this in consultation with them, or was this sort of a polygenesis?
More of a polygenesis, yeah. That they came to our attention, we came to their attention sort of during the same process. I mean, the connections between Newton and Moundridge are many and varied, so we found out pretty quickly.
Well, thank you so much. So many things to think about. I learned quite a bit too. It's interesting, the stream of thought now has a lot to do with immigrants and the things that we bring in. Next week, if you think it's not about immigration, it will be, because Pastor Rempel was the first of his family to be born in North America, which is interesting. But not only that, he's going to talk about a conflict that was brought over to the U.S. by immigrants back in Russia already, the MDGCs. That's something that came from the old country. So, we all bring our own stuff. And he's going to talk about our stuff, the sibling rivalry that we have. Thank you, Ben. Let's give him a hand. He needs to go back to Shalom, but he'll be here in the interim between the worship service, just briefly if you want to talk to him more, but he needs to get back to Shalom so they can celebrate Pentecost there. Let's gather to worship in a few minutes.